My husband's mistress's husband walked into my office on a Thursday afternoon and said, "Marry me tomorrow. We'll destroy them together." I told him yes before I'd finished processing the question. I was a corporate litigation attorney at Chambers & Reeve in Boston. 8 years of chasing fraudsters through discovery, building airtight cases from shredded paper trails and deleted emails, making sure people who thought they were untouchable learned otherwise. I was very good at my job. What I was apparently not good at was noticing that my own husband was dismantling my life from the inside. Carson ran Meridian Development, a mid-sized real estate firm out of Back Bay. We'd met at a mutual friend's dinner party 11 years ago. He was charming, ambitious, and had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the room. For 7 of our 8 years of marriage, I believed he was exactly who he said he was. The doubts started small, unexplained trips to New York, a credit card I'd never seen before, Carson working late in a pattern that had nothing to do with project deadlines. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the nature of my work made me see deception everywhere. I was wrong. What I didn't know until the moment Reed sat across from me was that Carson had been having an affair with Sabrina Ashford, the wife of Reed Ashford, CEO of Callaway Biomed, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in New England. I also didn't know that 6 weeks earlier, Carson had convinced me to sign a post-nuptial agreement. He'd come home tense one night, loosening his tie before he even got through the door. He said Meridian was facing a lawsuit from a former contractor. A frivolous claim, he said, but potentially damaging enough to freeze the company's assets during litigation. He said the safest move was to transfer our joint assets temporarily into his name alone, so they'd be shielded from any judgment against the company. Our Beacon Hill condo, our shared investment accounts. He said the family law attorney he'd spoken to had recommended it. He said it was just paperwork. I was a litigator. I should have read every line. But he was my husband. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has slept beside you for 8 years, who knows how you take your coffee and which side of the bed you prefer, who has sat with you in hospital waiting rooms and held your hand at both funerals. I signed. 2 weeks later, when Reed Ashford appeared in my office doorway with his sleeves rolled up and a folder under his arm, I understood what I had done. Your husband has been billing Callaway Biomed for real estate services his company never actually performed, Reed said, without preamble. He set the folder on my desk. Over the past year, Meridian Development has invoiced us for $8 million in commercial leasing consultancy and site acquisition work. I had our project managers verify every address. Not one of these properties was ever visited, contracted, or formally scoped. The money went to Carson. And then it came back to Sabrina. I opened the folder. Wire transfer records, invoice copies, a corporate org chart I recognized. Callaway's, with 2 names circled in red. Sabrina Ashford and a woman I didn't know, Gillian Pruitt, listed as Chief Financial Officer. "What do you want from me?" I said. "I need someone who can go in legally, with full authority, and pull the financial architecture apart from the inside. I'm the CEO, but Sabrina controls the CFO, the accounts payable department, and 4 members of the board. If I initiate an internal investigation using anyone connected to this company, she'll know before I've filed the first document request." Reed held my gaze. I need an outside legal mind. I need someone with a motive. And the marriage. My company's bylaws allow the CEO's legal spouse to hold an executive appointment. As general counsel, you'd have full discovery access to every financial record in that building and the legal standing to freeze transactions. Alone, I get stonewalled. With you inside the structure, we move faster than Sabrina can cover her tracks. I looked at the folder. I thought about the post-nuptial agreement I'd signed at the kitchen table, believing I was protecting us. I thought about the stack of files on my own desk, cases I'd built for clients who'd been defrauded by people they trusted. The bitter irony tasted like copper in my mouth. "I have conditions," I said. "Full autonomy over the legal investigation. You don't interfere with my process, you don't approve or deny my document requests, and you don't share my findings with anyone before I'm ready to go to the FBI." Reed studied me for a moment, agreed. "Then I'll be at City Hall at 9 tomorrow." The next morning, I wore a steel gray blazer and flat shoes. Reed was already there when I arrived, standing by the entrance with his hands in his coat pockets, looking less like a CEO and more like someone who hadn't slept. We went through the registration in under 40 minutes. When the clerk handed us our copies of the marriage certificate, I held mine and felt the same thing I feel when a judge signs an order I've spent 3 months drafting. Not joy, but the cold, clean click of something locking into place. Outside, I photographed the certificate against the stone railing. Then I opened my phone, found the contact I still had labeled with a small house emoji, the shorthand Carson and I had used since the early years, and typed, "Wanted you to hear it from me first. As of this morning, I'm Mrs. Ashford. Thank you for the clean exit. Good luck with Sabrina." His response came in 47 seconds. What the hell is this? Not even a question mark. That told me everything I needed to know about how rattled he was. I put my phone away. "I need to be at Callaway before 10, I said to Reed. "Can we go?" The headquarters of Callaway Biomed occupied 4 floors of a glass tower in the Seaport District. Reed introduced me to the executive team that morning in the main conference room on the 31st floor. He was brief and deliberate. I was the new general counsel, his wife, and effective immediately. All legal questions, contract approvals, and compliance matters ran through me. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when everyone is recalculating their position. In the back corner, a woman in a burgundy blazer sat very still. Jillian Pruett. I'd read her personnel file on the drive over. 17 years with the company, promoted to CFO 18 months ago, right around the time Sabrina had started deepening her foothold on Callaway's board. Jillian had signed off on every single invoice from Meridian Development. I noted the way she looked at me, not surprised, not curious. Just measuring. After the meeting, I walked directly to the finance department and requested access to the accounts payable system, the contract management platform, and 3 years of vendor correspondence. Jillian appeared in the doorway of the AP manager's office while I was waiting for credentials. "Ms. Chambers," she said, using my maiden name, which she would only know from a background check she had no reason to run. "The vendor files you're requesting fall under Standing Board Committee oversight. I'll need to flag this to the board chair before we can grant access." I turned to face her. The board chair is a non-executive role with no authority over legal discovery requests initiated by the general counsel. The only person whose authorization matters here is the CEO, and you just watched him appoint me 20 minutes ago. I kept my voice entirely neutral. "I'll also need the administrator credentials for the ERP system and all archived correspondence with Meridian Development. You have until 2 o'clock. Jillian held my gaze for a moment, then she turned and walked out. By 4 that afternoon, I had what I needed. The Meridian invoices were masterfully vague: commercial site assessment, Phase 2, leasing advisory services, Q3. Language, designed to survive a cursory audit but collapse the moment you asked for deliverables. I cross-referenced every invoice date with Callaway's internal project calendar. Not one of the supposed consulting engagements corresponded to an active real estate initiative. No meeting notes, no site reports, no signed scopes of work. Just wire transfers. 8 of them, totaling just over $8 million, each cleared with a rubber stamp approval from Jillian. I kept pulling. Buried in 3 years of vendor payments was a pattern I recognized from a case I'd argued 2 years earlier. The numbers were round. Too round. Fraud moves in round numbers because the people doing it are thinking in ballparks, not line items. 600,000 here, 400,000 there. Always just below the internal threshold that would have required a second signature. Whoever designed this scheme knew Callaway's internal controls exactly well enough to avoid them. That meant someone on the inside. I was still at my desk at 8:30 when Reed knocked and came in carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the lobby cafe. "The Meridian payments," I said, without looking up. "It's not just the $8 million. There's a second channel running through a subcontractor called Brixton Consulting Group. Same pattern, round numbers, vague descriptions, zero deliverables." I traced the EIN. Brixton Consulting Group was registered in Delaware 11 months ago. The registered agent is a law firm that also represents 3 of Carson's personal business entities. Reed set the coffee down and sat across from me. "How much total?" "Between Meridian and Brixton, closer to 12 million over 22 months. I turned the monitor toward him. "Sabrina has been using Callaway as a personal ATM. Carson runs the invoices through his company. Brixton channels a secondary cut, and the funds move back to Sabrina, disguised as consulting income on her personal tax returns." Reed stared at the screen. His jaw was set. "She told me the company was in a liquidity crunch, said we needed to cut the R&D budget. You cut research funding to cover a $12 million fraud." He looked at me then, and there was something raw in his expression that he didn't try to hide. What's next? I need to get to the FBI before Sabrina realizes what I've found. And I need you to say nothing to anyone on that board, not even the members you trust, until I give you the signal. The next morning, Sabrina called my direct line. She'd learned about my appointment through Gillian. The way people always find out things they're supposed to be too insulated to know. I don't know what story Reed told you, she said, controlled voice, but something underneath it. A tightness, like a wire pulled too far. But you're walking into something you don't understand. I understand it precisely, I said. I've spent the past 2 days reconstructing every transaction you've run through this company since Gillian was promoted. I've got the Delaware Incorporation papers for Brixton Consulting. I've got the wire records. I've got the invoice approvals with Gillian's signature and your verbal authorizations logged in the email threads she didn't think to delete. I paused. You should talk to a lawyer, Sabrina. A good one. Not the one who set up your shell companies. The line went quiet for a moment. Then, Carson told me about you. He said you were sharp. He also said you were soft. Carson has always had trouble reading people. It's probably why he's in this position. She hung up. That evening, Carson appeared outside Callaway's lobby. I watched him on the security feed, pacing near the entrance, hands in his jacket pockets, the same restless energy he'd always had when something wasn't going his way. I let him wait 20 minutes. Then I had the front desk call him a cab. What I didn't anticipate was that Sabrina had already started moving. 3 days later, a contact at Merrill Lynch who handled Callaway's institutional accounts called me. Someone had placed a liquidation order on a block of Callaway stock. 40,000 shares, held in a brokerage account under a trust name that appeared nowhere in the company's public disclosures. The sale was set to clear by Friday. 40,000 shares at current market price was just under $11 million. I spent that night drafting an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, citing active SEC investigation and material fraud concerns. By 7 the next morning, I was in federal court with a judge I'd appeared before twice in the past year. By 10, I had a signed order freezing all transactions over $50,000 connected to any account bearing Sabrina's name or her known affiliated entities. Reed was on a call with the Singapore office when I walked in and put the order on his desk. He read it, looked up, and said simply, "How?" "I've been a litigator for 8 years," I said. "I know how to move fast when someone is running." The freeze hit Sabrina's accounts on Thursday afternoon, 22 hours before her liquidation would have cleared. She called Carson from her broker's parking garage. He was in New Hampshire. I knew this from the private agent I'd retained 2 weeks earlier, a practical decision I'd made the moment Reed first told me what he suspected. Carson had driven up to his parents' house in Concord. My investigator said he seemed to be collecting things. I knew what that meant. I also knew that Carson's father, Gene, kept a fireproof safe in the study. The same study where Carson had grown up doing homework at a roll-top desk, surrounded by his mother Maureen's needlepoint, samplers, and Gene's collection of Red Sox programs from the 70s. I knew because I'd sat in that room every Thanksgiving for 8 years. Gene had shown me the safe once, explaining with quiet pride that it was where he kept anything that really matters. I drove to Concord that night. Reed drove with me. It was past midnight when we pulled into the driveway. The porch light was on. Gene answered the door in his robe and slippers, squinting into the dark, and when he recognized me, his face broke into something that was equal parts relief and confusion. "Eliza," he said, "what on earth?" I sat with Gene and Maureen at the kitchen table for a long time before I said anything that mattered. Maureen made tea. The kitchen smelled like the lavender plug-in she'd used for as long as I'd known her. On the refrigerator, held up by a lobster-shaped magnet, was a photo of Carson and me at his cousin's wedding 3 years ago. We looked happy. I remember that we were, that day. "Gene," I said finally, "I need to ask you something difficult." He looked at me over his mug. Gene was 67, with a kind of steady, plain-spoken decency that had always made me feel like Carson had something real to live up to. That same decency made this harder, not easier. "Carson mailed something up here a few weeks ago," I said. "Did he ask you to hold anything for him?" Gene and Maureen exchanged a look. Then Gene pushed back from the table without a word and went down the hall. He returned, carrying a padded envelope with post office tape still across the seal. "Said it was backup copies of project contracts," Gene said. Said he was having some IT trouble at the office. Inside were a portable hard drive and a USB flash drive. I didn't open them there. I thanked them both, told them they hadn't done anything wrong, and left with the envelope under my arm. Maureen walked us to the door and held my hand for a moment before she let go, the way she'd always done, the way I'd taken for granted for 8 years. Driving back to Boston in the dark, I made it 40 minutes before I started crying. Not because of Carson, but because Maureen had looked at me with so much warmth, and she had no idea that the world she thought she lived in, the one where her son was a hard-working businessman and her daughter-in-law was tied up in a difficult case, had already ended. Reed didn't say anything for a while. Then, quietly, "You're the most precise person I've ever watched do their job. And you're also the only decent person left in this entire mess." "That's not a compliment right now," I said. "I know, I meant it anyway." The drives contained exactly what I'd suspected. Not the sanitized corporate files, but Carson's personal records. A spreadsheet logging every payment he'd received from Meridian and Brixton, with Sabrina's initials beside each entry. Photographs of signed-off-the-books agreements between the two of them. Wire confirmations to an offshore account in Carson's name in the Cayman Islands, totaling just under $4 million. I handed everything to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division the following morning. The case agent I'd been coordinating with had been waiting for precisely this: physical evidence, in Carson's own handwriting, connecting him directly to the offshore transfers. The warrants came through within 48 hours. They arrested Carson at the Meridian Development Office on a Wednesday. He was in a meeting with 2 junior architects when the agents walked in. I know this because one of those architects later contacted the firm through a mutual connection, wanting to understand his own exposure. He had none, but he described Carson's face when the agents identified themselves: not angry, not defiant. Just blank, like a man who had spent a long time knowing this day was coming and had simply run out of road. They arrested Sabrina at Logan Airport, boarding a flight to Zurich. She had a carry-on bag with $120,000 in cash, 2 passports, one legitimate, one not, and a one-way ticket. She was still screaming about her attorney when they walked her through the terminal. The footage made 2 local newscasts and, briefly, national coverage. Gillian Pruett cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced charge and testified at length about how the scheme had worked, who had directed it, and how far back it went. Her testimony connected Sabrina to the Brixton entity without ambiguity. The trial ran 4 months. I sat in the gallery as often as I could, watching the evidence I'd assembled presented to a federal jury. Carson testified under a cooperation agreement, confirmed the full scope, named Sabrina as the architect, provided the spreadsheet. His attorney framed him as a man manipulated by a more calculating partner. There was some truth to that, not enough to matter very much. Sabrina received 14 years. Carson received 5, with the possibility of parole at 3, in recognition of his cooperation and the full financial restitution he'd agreed to. When the sentences were read, Sabrina let out a sound I'd never heard from another person in a courtroom and collapsed forward onto the defense table. Carson bowed his head and accepted it quietly. Before the marshals took him out, he looked back once toward the gallery. I didn't look away. I just let him look, and then he was gone. I went back to the office after the sentencing, sat at my desk, pulled up the post-nuptial agreement Carson had convinced me to sign, the document that had stripped me of our shared assets in 15 minutes on a Tuesday night. A court had already voided it on the basis that it was executed under false pretenses. The Beacon Hill condo was mine again. The investment accounts were mine again. On paper, I had come out ahead. I didn't feel like I'd come out ahead. I drafted a clean petition for dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences. Reed and I had accomplished what we'd set out to accomplish. The mission had terms, and the terms were met. He was a CEO with a company to rebuild. I was a litigator who needed to go back to building cases for other people. I left the envelope on his desk with a note that said simply, "Mission accomplished. Thank you for everything." He found it at 7 the next morning and was standing in my office doorway, 12 minutes later. "What is this?" he said, not quite a question. "The dissolution paperwork. I've also submitted my resignation as general counsel. Your HR team can begin the formal search for my replacement. I can provide a 2-week. Eliza." He sat down across from me. He hadn't sat across from me since the very first day in this office. I noticed that in a way I couldn't entirely account for. What do you actually want to do? I don't know, I said honestly. That's not an answer. I know. He looked at me for a long moment. I've at company for 11 years. I've made acquisitions worth hundreds of millions. I've sat across from some of the sharpest people in this industry. He paused. Nobody has ever reconstructed a $12 million fraud in 48 hours, secured a federal restraining order at 7 in the morning, and cried in a car driving through New Hampshire on the same day. I almost laughed. That's a very specific combination to find impressive. I find the whole picture impressive, Reed said. I also find it very difficult to imagine not working alongside you. And before you tell me that's a professional assessment, I'd like to point out that I drove to Concord in the middle of the night, and I didn't do that because of the case. I looked down at the dissolution petition on my desk. Then I looked back at him. You understand, I said carefully, that I'm not in a position to trust easily. That whatever this is, it would have to be built slowly. That I would be watching for every exit. I'm aware, Reed said. I was married to Sabrina for 9 years. I know exactly what it looks like when someone is always mapping the way out. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not her, and I don't think you're Carson, so maybe we just try. I didn't say yes immediately. I thought about it for a day. I called my older sister, who has always been the more practically wise of the two of us, and she said, Eliza, you took down a pharmaceutical fraud ring using a marriage license and a filing cabinet. I think you can figure out a relationship. She wasn't wrong. The dissolution petition stayed in my desk drawer, unsigned. Callaway Biomed's next quarterly report showed a 31% improvement in operating cash flow, the direct result of eliminating $12 million in fraudulent vendor expenses. Reed presented the figures to the board in October. Afterward, in the elevator, he handed me a copy of the report with a post-it on the cover page that read, Best acquisition decision I ever made. I peeled it off and folded it into my jacket pocket. The best revenge, I've come to understand, is not the sentencing or the gavel or watching someone who dismantled your life finally face the weight of what they did. That part satisfies for about 4 hours. The real thing, the lasting thing, is the quiet Tuesday morning when you look at where you are and realize the life you're living now, the one rebuilt from the wreckage of the one they tried to take from you, is so much larger and more solid than anything you had before. I still have that post-it. I carry it in the inside pocket of my favorite suit jacket, where I'll come across it unexpectedly every few months, and be reminded that some things, built on the strangest foundations, turn out to be exactly right.